This lesson is going to focus on going back and looking at all of our different forms of graphing quadratics that we've already talked about. If I look here, I can see standard form, vertex form, and factored form, which we just talked about in our last lesson, and what these different forms tell us about our graph. So if I'm looking at standard form, I see that standard form, our A value, will tell us if my graph opens up or down, and if my vertex is a minimum or a maximum. My C value, the value at the end, gives me the y-intercept of my graph. Vertex form also helps me identify if my graph opens up or down, if I have a minimum or a maximum. And my H and K values identify the vertex of my graph. And factored form will still, again, my A value will tell me if my graph opens up or down, if I have a minimum or a maximum. But it will also tell me the x-intercepts of the graph. So using all three of these forms, we can get a pretty good idea of what my graph will look like. Let's look first at converting from factored form to standard form and vertex form to standard form. In order to do that, I am going to have to multiply my two factors. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to distribute this 2 into my first factor. So 2 times x is 2x, 2 times 3 is 6. And now I see that I am multiplying two binomials. We like to use the box method when I multiply binomials. So I'll put 2x plus 6 along the side and x minus 1 across the top. 2x times x is 2x squared. 2x times negative 1 is negative 2x. 6 times x is 6x. And 6 times negative 1 is negative 6. So after I multiply, I can see that my final answer, after I combine my like terms, which are my two middle terms here, will give me a standard form equation of 2x squared plus 4x minus 6. I can use the same idea with vertex form, except this time I see that I have an x minus 4 squared. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to multiply, because x minus 4 squared is just the same thing as x minus 4 times x minus 4. So x times x is x squared. X times negative 4 is negative 4x. I have another negative 4x and a positive 16. So I'm going to rewrite this as negative 1 times, inside my parentheses, I'll have x squared. Negative 4x plus negative 4x would be negative 8x plus 16. Next, I will distribute my negative 1 to each value inside the parentheses to get negative x squared positive 8x minus 16 plus 7. And then I see I have two like terms here, negative 16 plus 7. If I add negative 16 plus 7, I get negative 9. So I've just converted vertex form to standard form. Now let's look at my graphs. If I look at a graph, I can write the different forms of my equations. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write this graph, the equation of this graph, in factored form. I do that by looking at my x-intercepts, positive 5 and negative 7. But remember, I need to write the opposite of those values in my parentheses. So instead of a negative 7, I'm going to write plus 7. And instead of a positive 5, I'm going to write a negative 5. To write our equation in vertex form, we need to look at the vertex, which is at -1, -36. So remember, that is my h and my k value. So the general form of this equation should be x minus h squared plus k. So we take the opposite of our h value, so the opposite of a -1 will be a +1, and keep the k value of -30. We are going to use the same idea on number 2. I'm going to do that vertex form first. My vertex is at 0, -16. So if I write this in vertex form, I'll have x minus 0 squared minus 16, which I can keep there. But when I think about that, do I really need a minus 0? And the answer to that is no. I could rewrite this as x squared minus 16, which is actually the standard form of our equation. And then if we look at the last one, let's look at our standard form first. The value at the end, if I remember, is my y-intercept. And if I look here, my y-intercept is at 15. So I'm just going to place a plus 15 at the end here. Factored form looks at my x-intercepts, which in this case are at -5 and -3. Remember, we need to do the opposite of both of those. So that would be a +5 and a +3. And that is how we can tell the equations of our graphs in 3 different forms.